Greetings, my fellow pit dwellers. Are you in the market for a heavy-hitting juggernaut of a deck? Well, look no further, for I present to you Barbed, Castaway, Riptide. With the introduction of our slimy new arrow, Murky Waters, aim counter Riptide finally has a good answer to his bigness weakness, which was that you could just easily fatigue him out and not trigger his traps. There was also a point when playing Barbed, Castaway, Riptide, where your opponent would go, wonder what happens if I just take an off turn and don't trigger any of his traps. And your following turn would consist of extending a firm handshake and saying GG, because there's just nothing you can do. So essentially, there is now a genuinely good reason to play Barbed, Castaway, Riptide after all this time. When I first started messing around with the list, there were two issues that I felt needed to be solved. The first was how to deal with aggro decks, and the second was trying to make the payoff for aim-related cards actually worth it. My solution for the first was to throw as much disruption at them as possible to slow the game down. For decks like Zen, we have plenty of good relevant arrows that let us do this. The solution for problem B was just to trim down heavily on a lot of the aim stuff because it just isn't worth it. There are some good aim cards that are in here to take advantage of our bow, but my rule is they have to be good even without the aim counter. For the most part, we want to avoid paying that one to load with our bow, as more often than not we go below rate when doing this. So that is fine if you have evasion, but in general, we don't have evasion on most turns. The general play pattern of the deck then is to play traps from hand, use Riptide to reload, and then shoot an arrow back. Traps essentially play the part of a buff on your opponent's turn, and they're above rate if we get to trigger the effects. We also do play normal buffs for the same reason, and that reason is we just don't want to load the bow if possible. To sum up, both effects on Riptide's hero ability feel like they are used in equal part in this deck. We're going to move on to the equipment suite now. So we have New Horizons. Go read Barbed Castaway and tell me that it wasn't designed with this helmet in mind. It also pairs well with Perch Grapplers if you want to close out a game with a 3-arrow wide turn. The 2-block on it doesn't hurt either. Next up is Trench of Sunken Treasure. If you're playing Murky Waters, you need to play Trench. You can also use the one resource you get from Trench to load on our opponent's turns when dodging like a CNC, something like that. The AB one is relevant against Runeblade, but just forget about Kano. Like, the matchup's lost, you can win it. It's the one auto loss of the deck. Next up we have Long Draw Half Glove. This is the hidden spice from Mistveil. This card is 100% designed to work with this deck, and it does. If you want to block brain points more easily because your traps defend for 3, then Long Draw helps you do that. If you want to cover up a CNC in tandem with Perch Grapplers, then this card lets you do that. And if you find yourself in hands that have just arrows and only D-reacts, then you can actually still turn them into some good offensive power using Long Draw Half Glove. So it feels like a natural inclusion for the deck. Lastly, for the equipment, we have our Perch Grapplers. This, for the most part, is just a 2-block. But towards the end of the game, if you find yourself with space, you can use this to go and hit your opponent for a 3-arrow wide turn. The Barbed Castaway enables this play because you can flip up a face-down arrow, load in another arrow face-up, and then finish off the turn with a Codex of Frailty. Speaking of which, now for the weapon that is essentially the core identity of the deck. I'll start off by saying that this bow, if anything else, is just really fun to use. It being instant speed is amazing for dodging Arsenal Disruption when combined with Trench, and for negating hand disruption. If I've drawn a no-trap hand against like Nu, for example, what I'll often do is if they come at me with a Bonds of Agony, I'll give them 2 cards from hand, and if they do decide to go into reaction town, what you can do is pitch one of those 2 cards away that you've kept in hand, and then load the last card in your hand, which is presumably an arrow. That way they don't get any of the on-hit effects that actually affect you besides like the shuffle. So it's very good for stuff like that. It basically enables a lot of nice little tricks. As I said before, you generally want to avoid paying the cost to load this bow on your own turn. I see it more as a way to dodge disruption or a last resort due to Riptide's hero text being so good. The aim counter effect is a lot more relevant and gives us access to some cool tools. We're actually playing Dreadbore in the sideboard. This is in here for matchups where the aim counters don't really matter. So think things like Dory, Enigma. You just kind of put the Dreadbore in there instead of the Barbed Castaway because it's more value. And the last piece of equipment is the Quiver Abyssal Depths. No other quiver is really relevant, so this is basically the default, and it does let you recycle important arrows, which does come up, so nice piece of equipment. Onto the arrows now, we have the star of the show, Murky Water. This arrow is essentially what Riptide has been crying out for since he came out. It's a popper with a really good on-hit effect, and it also has evasion. It is actually one of the few arrows involving aim counters that goes above rate. I would recommend that you make sure to run traps in multiples of 3 to get the most value out of your Murky Water. Also, be aware that it isn't your win condition into every matchup, so even though it is a murky new toy, you don't want to be prioritizing it if you don't have to. That being said, I can't tell you how good it feels to finally be playing an arrow that really meshes well with the way in which it feels Riptide was designed to be. If fools want to come into this matchup thinking, oh, I could just block and swing my weapon, then bashing them on the head multiple times with a 7 to 16 dominate arrow should change their minds. Next up we have Battering Bolt. This is a popper that also murders every Mystic, Assassin, Warrior and Illusionist deck. Really good for slowing down Zen. Like Murky Waters, it does so much for the deck, and in this style of list it's easy to pay for, so you can justify running it. For our first zero cost arrow of the day we have Immobilizing Shot. This is relevant into decks that don't want to block, so it's fine to play even if it's below rate, because paying the 1 always makes it below rate essentially. I'll just quickly mention a notable exemption from the list, and that is Barbed Undertow. I think that in this meta it is basically a worse Battering Bolt, as it's below rate, inconsistent, and it isn't a popper. Like, it seems good on paper into Enigma, but in practice you have to invest a lot of your hand into this card, and most of the time it comes in for 8, which is easily blocked out and allows Enigma to keep her board. So that's just one example of why I don't think the card's worth it. Going back to what I said earlier about only playing aim cards that are good without the aim counter, Immobilizing Shot's floor is 0 for 4, so if you pair that with a nice buff, that's a really efficient 2-card hand still, whereas paying 1 for 5 just doesn't make sense, especially if you don't get the on-hit, which multiple times will happen if you draw it into your hand without like a buff or a trap. Next arrow that we have lined up is a Drill Shot. This is 0 for 4 that has an on-hit even with the aim counter, and the aim counter is nice to have because if you see Drill Shot early, they either have to give you extra equipment to stop it or cards from hand, and both options are good for us. Murkmire Grapnel is every ranger's favourite card at the minute. It's the same as Drill Shot in that it is good without the encounter. Murkmire is our get out of jail free card versus Enigma if their board gets out of control. As a buff, Murkmire combined with like Dreadbore and a few buffs is just really hard to block out. It's also very good into Prism. Probably the best 0 for 4 arrow in the deck is Endless Arrow. The turn cycles where you just block out with your entire hand and then shoot them with Endless, repeat. It's just really fun and really efficient. And plus, it's our second best answer into fatigue matchups. On to our 1 for 5 arrows, we've got Remorseless. This lets you keep up with Zen when he goes really wide, and it shuts off all D-reacts when you're playing Dreadbore matchups. It's just an arrow you play based on the meta, essentially. Same thing for Sleep Dart. This is mainly in here for Zen in place of Barbed Undertow, because it's just more consistent and it kind of does the same thing. But it has applications against other decks like Prism, Levia, and a few other kind of weird lower tiered decks. Onto the blue arrows, we have Sedation Shot. I chose this over Blue Infecting Shot as you really don't need the damage, and as we are a control deck, we'd rather keep our opponents off big turns if we can. And the damage on Infecting doesn't really matter because it's so easily blocked out. So in theory, a good card, but I found in practice it either did nothing when it hit because the opponent just doesn't care, or if they do care, they just block it out quite easily. So I figured Sedation Shot is better into aggro matchups because they don't want to block, and it's even better if you can give a breakpoint to it as well. Our other blue arrow is Intoxicating Shot. We have so many traps in this list, so giving our opponent the on-hit isn't that much of a detriment because we can almost guarantee that we can punish it. So you can use this arrow a bit more freely because of that. Ideally, use it to pitch early game, and then late game it does truly become a 0 for 4. And in those scenarios where you're both on low health, your opponent is taking a big risk by allowing it to hit. The only non-arrow attack that we're playing in the deck is Command and Conquer, and it's a good one. It fits nicely with the cost curve of the deck, and you can send it for 9 with Premeditate. This is also just good disruption into Zen, and good disruption in general. I think pretty much every deck this format is on CNC, and for good reason. Onto the buffs now. We run a fair few buffs to ensure that we are able to threaten our opponents with small efficient hands, or big ones if they take an off turn to set up, and especially if they decide to disrespect the big green boy's damage potential. So to kick things off, we have both Seek and Destroy and Lace with Inertia. They are both in here to help us try and slow down the pace of the game. Seek and Destroy is, in most cases, a little bit better. If there's a lot of Enigma where you are, feel free to drop the Inertia one for a Lace with Blood Rot. Best buff in the deck is Premeditate. This just works with literally every single attack in your deck and gives you that sweet ponder. Moving on to the yellow buffs, we have Deadeye. If you've seen my Battle Hardened Valencia deck tech, you'll know that I think this card is good enough to run even without it having any text in terms of the encounter section. So now that we are pairing it with actual cards that do have encounters, it becomes even better. Working this in with a Murky Water that has its encounter is probably the most devastating combo the deck has. And as with many cards in the deck, it just helps slow the game down. It's a good offensive card, it's a good defensive card because it blocks 3, and it's a good pitch card, so what's not to love, you know? Lastly, for our buffs, we have Rain Razors. This at worst is a resource card, but it also helps you load your arrows face down, which is important for giving aim counters, and it can give you that extra bit of evasion to push your on hits. Zen, for example, will often give you his armor to set up his big pop-off turn, so giving a Rain Razors on top of, say, a blocked out Sleep Dart or a mobilizing shot will completely wreck his upcoming turn. On to other cards in the deck that are just action cards or random bits and bobs. We have Three of a Kind. This is a bit of a weird tech choice, but I found myself liking this more and more. It lets you play big arrows off of small hands. So it does the opposite of why you played it in Lexi. You play it to go tall, not to go wide. And plus, it gets you that reload when you play it from hand, which is something you really want. For example, if you have a card in Arsenal, Three of a Kind in hand, and Murky Waters, you can bottom the card in Arsenal with Trench, play the Three of a Kind, trigger Riptide to put the Murky Waters into your arsenal. You then draw 3 cards, which means you're guaranteed to be able to flip the Murky Waters and fire it. And if you draw well and say you get a yellow and 2 reds, one of which is a trap, you can arsenal the trap at the end of your turn as well. So yeah, really flexible, good card that lets you block out and still have quite an offensively potent turn. Next up we have Codex of Blooddrop. This is a good resource card, it's a good arsenal card, and it helps force through damage. It's especially good into Prism and Enigma for obvious reasons, because of the Blooddrop. I see this as being an alternate option to Lace with Blooddrop, so instead of giving you the +3, it just gives you a card at the end of your turn, which is normally valued at 3, so it kind of balances out, and of course it's a yellow. Codex of Frailty. Now, there's actually probably one thing you don't know about Codex of Frailty. Besides it being incredibly broken, it is also... Last card before we move on to our traps is Remembrance. Our games will often go on very long, and sometimes fatigue is actually a primary win condition for us. However, I mostly have Remembrance in here for matchups that I worry could end up in me being fatigued instead. So think decks like Guardians, Assassins. 2 Remembrances is essentially 6 more dominated Murky Waters. If you don't have a lot of fatigue wherever you are though, you should probably just drop this and play something else, as it's not needed to win, it's just kind of here as an insurance policy. Also, it being a yellow means it doesn't hurt too bad to have it in your hand, because it can be your resource card. And it also triggers Riptide. It's the moment everyone's been waiting for, it's time for the traps. So, I don't run any crew traps at all, I hate them. I tried fitting them in this list because I thought, surely they'd be fine because I run so many traps and other things that could maybe trigger them to get into my arsenal. But no, they still just lose you games and force you to block weirdly, so I just cut them entirely. They also just actively go against the playstyle of the deck because we want to be putting arrows like Murky Water face down into Arsenal, and so putting a crew trap there in its place kind of, it doesn't synergize well with the playstyle, it just doesn't feel good. I will say, for formats or locals that have a lot of fatigue or are a bit slower, I would actually play the crew traps just to help guarantee damage, because if you play just 6 crew traps, you're guaranteeing 8 damage if you're counting the reload, or sorry, the graveyard refill from Murky Waters over the course of the game. So you basically put your opponent on 32 life, which will definitely help a lot. And they're also less likely to be a detriment because you have time to not, well, you're maybe not forced into blocking with everything in your hand. Anyway, onto the traps I do like. We've got Frailty Trap. This is good into Enigma and adds trap density for our Assassin matchup. One bit of advice against Assassin is don't waste this on a dagger. It's tempting to trigger the effect, but you're only getting 3 value here, maybe 4 if they have something in Arsenal, but it is generally better to save it for their attack actions, as covering up the on-hits and say like a Bonds of Agony is way better than just stopping dagger, for example. And that's even if they were going to swing 2 daggers at you in the first place. Next up we have Inertia Trap. This is good into everyone right now, except Kano, but we're not good into Kano in general, so who cares? The Inertia token helps us control the flow of the game a bit more by hopefully preventing bigger turns from our opponent. Onto our yellow traps, we have Boulder Trap. The yellow traps, in my opinion, are strictly better than the red ones, as their floor is much higher and their ceiling for the most part is higher too. Removing armor off your opponent is just so good in Riptide, because now that Endless Arrow coming for 7 has to be blocked with only cards from hand. And most decks are not running D-Reacts at the minute, so that usually entails them taking damage and you getting your arrow back, or they give you 3 cards and you're happy either way. It's also relevant into decks like Zen. Even though they are aggro, they do pack a lot of armor, so getting some counters on that armor early means that they can't just give you armor when they want to go for that pivot turn. So I think Boulder Trap is definitely a good meta call at the minute. Our other yellow trap is Tar Pit Trap. So the floor on this is good, as with Boulder Trap, as it can be a resource card. Its effect has a lot of relevance for stopping things like Tiger Swipe, breakpoints from the new Dash.io deck that runs a crap ton of boom grenades, Heralds and Prism 2, and unlike Frailty Trap, this one is good to use on the Assassin daggers because you get the ping effect. You basically get the same amount of value as a minimum because they can hit you with as big a Bonds of Agony or CNC or Shakedown as they like, it still will just be vanilla damage. I am also playing 3 legendary traps. We've got Buzzsaw, Collapsing Trap, and we have Spike Pit Trap. We play all of them because they're all really good, especially for this slower kind of Riptide deck. It could be a resource card, so the floor is very, very good, and the effect can generally get you just so much value. That is the deck in its entirety. So, why play this version of the deck over some other Riptide variants? Well, for now you'd have the surprise factor, but aside from that, the deck does have an interesting matchup spread. Unlike the faster Riptide lists, you have a much better time into Guardian, because Murky Waters being able to dominate means that they can't just block you out for the whole game, and you're actually a lot better at blocking. So a problem that Riptide has is Guardian can try and aggro you, and if you start to put on a bit too much pressure, they can just swap to Fatigue and block you out really, really well. That's not really an option with Murky Waters. If they choose to go slow with Murky Water in the deck, then you're just going to start hitting them for like 10, 13, 16 dominate, and they can't stop that. So they have to try and race you, and that's good for you. And playing 2 Remembrances as well, if they see you pitching that really does kind of put them off Fatigue. I think you're also more favoured into Warrior and Assassin due to the higher D-React count, and generally you are better at Defensive Evasion. That being said, you are actually already favoured into those classes already, so it doesn't matter too much maybe, unless there's a lot of them in your local area. You can also rely on Fatigue in some cases as a reliable win condition if that's the way you choose to play. No judgment here. Generally speaking, you have a solid matchup spread. The only horrible one is Kano. You just can't win that. You could try putting in like 3 Sigil, 3 Oasis, AB3, 3 Feign Death, but they can still just kill you through that because you're just a little bit too slow to really do anything. Illusionist is generally tougher, but it's not unwinnable. It's still a game, and aggro can be difficult, as one mistake will often cost you the game. So if you play tight, you do have really good chances. You just have to make sure you don't screw up, basically. However, with all that being said, if you are wanting to know the ultimate reason to actually play this list, then I will tell you. It's really fun.